Aloha and welcome to Island Connections. I'm Brahim Aoudi. Jonathan Okamura on ethnicity, class, and public policy. Thank you, John, for coming over and sharing your thoughts with us. And this is a special program because this is your last semester with the Department of Ethnic Studies. Then you retire and you will have like free parking, right?
Well, I'm more interested in my office.
Yeah, no,
Being able to keep that.
I'm just kidding. Yeah. So first, what we would like, to do as we go over your work, 4 books and multiple articles, and all of that, and a bunch of reports, right, and so on. So we would like first to start, with your background, and then in terms of academic, etc., how you started, and then where you are at this point, and then we go into like details of certain things like race, ethnicity, class, gender, and the rest of it.
Okay. Well, my training is in social anthropology. I went to the University of London, University College London, for my PhD, and that was in 1972. And I returned to Hawaii in 74 to start my fieldwork with Filipino immigrants in Kalihi, but with no grant, you can't really get started. So I was working at Sears for about 6 months till I got fired. But eventually I started the fieldwork, late 79, and I finished the dissertation and the fieldwork in 3 years. I had my defense in December of 1982, and returned to Hawaii. I was teaching at Kapiolani Community College, where I reconnected with you. Since we were there together as lecturers. And then I went to the Philippines for 3 years, and I taught and did research there. And we returned to Hawaii in 1987. My first job at the university was with the School of Public Health, which doesn't exist anymore. It's just an office, Public Health Studies. But I was lecturing with ethnic studies from 1990, and then hired in 2000 in a tenure track position. So I've been with the department for about 20 years now, more than 20 years, teaching courses on Japanese in Hawaii, ethnic identity, race and ethnicity in Hawaii.
Yeah, so you have been very productive in terms of like books, single-authored books and edited books and multiple articles and like journals like Amerasia, etc. So why don't we start with the most recent book? And in terms of this allows us to talk about race, ethnicity, and this how the transformation occurred and all of that, But first of all, I would like to show the viewers your book, Race to Death in 1920s Hawaii, the Fukunaga case. And this is extremely, important in Hawaii's history, etc. We had other cases, but this is the one that is really important. And so could you tell us your interest in this, and then the publication and so forth?
Well, I had heard about this case, I think, in the late 70s. And I used to lecture about it in the Japanese in Hawaii course, but I thought I couldn't really write a book about it because I didn't speak or read Japanese. But when I started the research, I found out there are numerous articles published in the Star Bulletin and the Advertiser in English, and also the Japanese newspapers, the Hawaii Hochi and the Nippu Jiji, had these English language sections that discussed the case. So at that point, this is about 10 years ago, I started the research in the archives collection at Hamilton Library and also the microfilm collection. And my focus, as in just about all the work I do, is on race, the racial dimensions of the Fukunaga case, not written as a true crime story. I was interested, well, what does this case tell us about how race operated in Hawaii as the dominant organizing principle of social relations? So I focused especially on the racial injustice against Fukunaga that led to his very quick conviction and death sentence. So that's why it's called race to death. He was convicted as a Japanese American, not as an individual without regard to race, and he was rushed very quickly to his death sentence. And there are numerous examples of racial injustice that I bring out in the case. It's also very much related to the better-known Massie Kahavai case, which occurred 3 years later. And so in the final chapter, I compare the two cases, and particularly the two individuals, Joe Kahavai and Maoz Fukunaga, and argue that Kahavai was also raced to death.
Absolutely. He was shot, I mean, kidnapped and shot, you know. Yeah, in fact, when I teach about Hawaii, I talk about the Fukunaga case and the Massie case, etc., and make comparisons, etc., because this is important in terms of Hawaii, and also how race was dominant at one point, and later on it moved into some other thing called ethnicity, you know, if you will. And something that's interesting here is like this book is dedicated to Kekuni Blaisdell. So could you tell us why Kekuni and all of that, and the relationship between the indigenous and the local?
Well, I met Kekuni after I came back from the Philippines, 1989, and then we got along very well because, well, he's such a warm person. I think that had a lot to do with it. And my daughter also met him at this time. She was about 2 years old when we came back, and she developed her own friendship with Kekuni also that I was very pleased to see. But Kekuni, I think of as someone, in relation to this book, as someone who certainly advocated justice for Native Hawaiian people. And I believe he would have supported the kinds of arguments I make about racial injustice as applied both to Japanese Americans and also Native Hawaiians like Joe Kahavai at that time. But I have a picture of Kekuni in my office that is from the program at his memorial service that was held at the School of Medicine. And the reason I keep it there is because I want him to remind me of how I need to relate to people, because he set such a high standard of the aloha that he had, that he shared with others. And it's something I try to follow in my own relationships with others.
Yeah, because Kekuni, I mean, he's an icon. You know, and speak about him in the present, like medical doctor. You know, he did all kinds of good stuff. You know, as a medical doctor, but also, you know, he was in the indigenous movement highly respected, and in my estimation, the most advanced of all these activists, in my estimation, about the relationship between the indigenous and the non-indigenous, and in terms of imperialism, colonialism, and all of that, you know. So he had a global perspective, actually. Yeah, and this is something that's very important in any indigenous struggle, including my indigenous struggle.
Sure.
Yeah. So I just wanted to mention that. So, like you mentioned about Kahavai and all of that, and you have like some kind of comparative analysis, I guess, or reflections on one and the other case. So could you say a little bit more about that, because that would bring us to the next book, you know, in the sense of race and ethnicity. Yeah.
Well, the argument I make is both Fukunaga and Joe Kahavai were raced to death because they violated the dominant racial boundary in Hawaii at that time between Haules rather and non-Haules, and that's why they were both quickly sent to, well, their deaths, early deaths, as young men, working class background, living in Honolulu at that time. And another argument I make is that, well, Kahavai's lynching is connected to the Fukunaga case, but also cases of Japanese and Filipino labor leaders, beginning with the 1920 strike, who were convicted on perjured testimony and sent to Oahu prison for years because they also challenged the dominant racial boundary. So my argument is that there's this trajectory I call of racial injustice beginning in the 1920s with the 1920 strike that continues into the early 1930s with the lynching of Joko Hawai and the very shortly commuted sentence of 1 hour given to his 4 killers who were convicted of manslaughter instead of first-degree murder.
In the governor's office for 1 hour, drinking coffee maybe.
And posing for pictures to memorize that event. But that's part of my argument regarding how race was the dominant organizing principle. And I did some other research during my sabbatical last year to also highlight how race was significant in terms of capital punishment and how, because Haoles were the dominant group, only one Haole was executed from 1900 till 1957 when capital punishment was abolished, while 24 Filipinos were of the 42 persons, grossly overrepresented. And this is because of their racialization as being prone to violence and crime and viewed as emotionally impulsive, etc. And the abolition of capital punishment was also racialized because it occurred after the Democrats, largely supported by non-Haoles, took control of the legislature and immediately submitted bills for the abolition of the death penalty, which came about in 1957.
Yeah, which is interesting. But you know, the other thing in terms of racialization and race as an organizing principle in Hawaii up to, shall we say, the 30s, 40s, it's many of the laws were patterned after the antebellum South, you know, right? I mean, laws even before, you know, the overthrow of the monarchy, etc. These laws were patterned after the laws in the South.
Well,
yeah. So could you say something?
Well,
about
up
that?
until the Bayonet Constitution.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep.
1887.
Because,
yeah.
1887. Because prior to that time, the kingdom, the constitution of the kingdom could be said to be colorblind.
Yeah.
If one was born in the kingdom, one could become a citizen, or one could become naturalized. One could vote. This was the case for Chinese born in Hawaii and a few Japanese after arriving in 1885. But that all changed with the Bayonet Constitution. Then there are these restrictions based on race regarding voting and naturalization. But there's some similarities, but one of those that differs in terms of the laws was no prohibition on interracial marriage in Hawaii.
And this played big time in Hawaiian sociology, you know? Could you say something about that?
Yeah. Well, I was telling my class, because we're talking about the work of Ramonzo Adams, who came to Hawaii 100 years ago to start the Department of Sociology and Social Work here. And then he was followed by Andrew Lin, who came in the mid-1930s, I believe, and Bernard Horman, who grew up in Hawaii, the son of German immigrants, and went to Punahou and the University of Chicago, from where Adams came, and also Lind, who did his doctorate there. But they were heavily influenced by Robert Park, who was the leading sociologist at Chicago and best known for his race relations cycle, assimilation being the last stage of that cycle. So they were all assimilationists, and they emphasized different aspects of Hawaii society that they saw as different from the continental U.S., such as no law against intermarriage, or the notion of equality that Adams introduced, what he called the unorthodox racial doctrine of Hawaii. But as assimilationists, they had this view of Hawaii as providing for upward mobility, especially Lind and Horman in the sense of integration, that aspect more so than acculturation. And that led to the view of Hawaii subsequently as a multicultural paradise, where everybody gets along with each other in tolerance and harmony. These ideas still prevail.
Yeah, I mean, we'll talk more about that because, I mean, it's really critical to see, like, not much has changed since in those main concepts, you know. But I just wanted to say that, I mean, in terms of Hawaiian sociology, etc. And the buying of the, you know, the whole lock, stock, and barrel of, you know, American democracy and, you know, America is the greatest thing. So the best thing for upward mobility is you know, like assimilation, etc. And then you become a great guy. And actually, I just want to jump the gun a little bit. This happened, in fact, and a bunch of, you know, Asian Americans or, you know, Asians in Hawaii, local Asians, bought that one. And that's the transformation after World War II, right? So before we go to your next book, which is actually interesting, From Race to Ethnicity, could you say something about that period and the rise of the Democratic Party, etc.? You know, I mean, the whole 442nd phenomena and stuff like that. If you can tell the viewers about it, you know.
Well, my argument about race to ethnicity is that ethnicity became the dominant organizing principle after race during the pre-World War II period, beginning with labor organizing by the LWU in that economic sphere, and then it was followed by the coming to power of the Democratic Party, which then provided more opportunities for socioeconomic mobility through funding, greater funding of public education, including the university, raising the minimum wage, greater funding for welfare benefits, abolition of the death penalty. These are things that, these kinds of social values that the Democratic Party represented in the 50s into the 60s, less so from then on. Certainly at present, it's become a very centrist party. So, but in the first couple of decades after the 46 strike, we have these opportunities.
The sugar strike, 46,
Sorry?
The sugar strike.
Yeah, sugar strike, led by the ILWU. We have these opportunities for socioeconomic mobility provided that allowed Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans, Korean Americans to rise in socioeconomic status, to fully become part of the middle class. But those opportunities ended, I would say, by the 70s, as tourism became entrenched as the dominant industry with its creation of primarily service and sales work, low wage, low mobility, low security. And by those three groups that I mentioned earlier advancing themselves, what they did was separate themselves also from Hawaiians and Filipinos, the two other major ethnic groups in Hawaii at that time. And therefore, this is part of the process of ethnicity becoming more significant. The breakdown of that dominant racial boundary historically in Hawaii between Haoles and non-Haoles. So ethnicity, I would say, is the dominant principle since the 70s to the present.
Yeah, and you can see that like in the 20s with the strikes, you know, even like the strikes before that in the late 19th century and early 20th, you talk about the Japanese race, the Chinese race, you know, and a lot of people are still talk about it like Japanese race, etc., which is not true, you know. I mean, it wasn't true then, and it's not true now. But that shows you like how like conceptualization and socialization created those kinds of terminologies, you know.
Sure.
Yeah.
No, that's part of the social construction of race.
Absolutely.
Historically, yes, exactly what you said. People used to talk about the Hawaiian race, which they certainly aren't either. But as I said, over time, and certainly by the 70s, people started invoking ethnicity more, talking about the groups here as ethnic groups, not races. And so there are kinds of racial categories that one finds on the continent, like Asian American, are just not used at all, except by academics or journalists. But in terms of the social construction of ethnicity, this is what prevails rather than race.
Yeah. Now, the other thing is that in terms of a lot of public policies, I mean, I'm still going 30s, 40s, 50s, like 1954 Democratic Revolution, which is a major, point, in terms of, watershed, for the development. So in terms of this kind of struggle, for workers' rights, etc., and not only workers' rights, because workers are part of society. So you have like better educational system, more reforms, this, that, and the other. So how the labor unions were able to affect those kinds of policies, public policies, because they came together, and talk about themselves, at least, in that vein, as we are all workers, etc., etc. So could you say something about that and how it might relate to the previous period and, in terms of labor organizing, like 1920, 24, as opposed to the 30s,
You mean historically?
Yeah.
Well, it was like you said, there were strikes by only Japanese, only Filipinos, or unions organized. The Japanese Federation of Labor, the Filipino Labor Union. Only after the ILW came to Hawaii do we find multiracial unions. Actually, it started before the war with organizing of dock workers, both here and in Hilo. But then martial law prevailed. There's no labor organizing. And the ILW, after the war, was immediately able to bring together all workers on the plantations, on the docks, into what they called one big union. And certainly and they supported the Democratic Party in its rise to power, subsequently in the 50s. But, and that was the formula for success for Democratic Party candidates, ILW support and also support of the Japanese-American World War II veterans. But the unions aren't as certainly powerful as they were before, and we find the Democratic Party not terribly sympathetic to some of our public worker unions, especially the teachers at present. They're just ignoring their calls for increased wages and working conditions. So this is part of the situation now in terms of what the Democratic Party stands for or doesn't stand for. And certainly it's not the party that promoted public education, including the University of Hawaii anymore. Both the university and the K-12 system are very underfunded. And the party is not interested. Those at the legislature anyway, Democratic members of the legislature aren't, to me, overly concerned to address that issue.
Yeah, someone is gonna run. I forgot who, against Scott Saiki, in his district. So because of these kinds of things, this is just one quick example. But in terms of, let's go to your other book, From Race to Ethnicity, and we started talking about that. But I want to say something regarding the rise of the Democratic Party, the '54 revolution, etc. The assimilationist thing really won the day. I mean, Inoue would be one major example of that. Senator, late Senator Inoue, etc. And he wouldn't want to talk about ethnic groups or whatever. It's just like we are all Americans, that kind of stuff. On the one hand, on the other hand, you see, in terms of the social struggles in Hawaii, for against eviction and stuff like that, moving in the other direction, not assimilationist, but showing the kind of discrimination and all of that. So could you speak a little bit about that period? Meanwhile, I'll show From Race to Ethnicity. The first one, Race to Death, is 2019. And this one, Race to Ethnicity, is 2014. All right. So I'll show it right here. It's good. These are good books. You can get them from the library, I guess, or buy them. Buy them better.
Or you can go online also. This is a
Online.
painting by my mother I used.
Yeah, your mother.
A watercolor painting.
Wow,
that,
wonderful. All right,
I
so
put on the cover.
that's it. Yeah, very good. Yeah, so could you say something about what we were just?
Well, because of those economic political transformations after the war, like I said, some groups were able to benefit and to rise socioeconomically and politically, like Japanese Americans, through the kinds of opportunities created at that time. But other groups, like Hawaiians and Filipinos, who had supported the Democratic Party rise and had supported, or certainly were part of the labor movement, they have been left behind. And this is the reason why we find the emergence of the sovereignty movement in the 70s. We also see in the 70s, when I came back to Hawaii, started my research on Filipino immigrants, these charges of discrimination against them in the DOE, non-hiring of Filipino former teachers, for example, or their underrepresentation in state government. Unfortunately, that has not continued. This anti-racism and discrimination movement among Filipinos, even though they continue to be very underrepresented in government and as students at the university and faculty also. So this is one of my major concerns, the ways in which the inequality in Hawaii has increased from the 70s, that Japanese, Chinese Americans joined whites, certainly by the 1990s, as the three dominant groups socioeconomically, as measured by occupational, educational, and income status. But I don't see that gap closing from the 70s on, as I said, because we're so dependent on tourism. And it does not create jobs that can provide collective mobility of groups. Individual mobility is still very possible in Hawaii. Both you and I know in our classes we have students, Hawaiian, Filipino, Samoan, from disadvantaged backgrounds. Nonetheless, they can come to the university, get a bachelor's degree, get a professional job, and enter the middle class. But the numbers that are involved in this process are not substantial enough that we can talk about collective mobility.
Yeah. Here, I mean, in terms of like, you know, ethnicity as an organizing principle and the question of class, and we discuss this so often, the two of us, yeah. but the thing is that, you know, you see like more, I mean, that's your point, and of course it's correct because it's observable, you know, more like Japanese, more Chinese, etc. in the upper income brackets, you know, and either like, you know, business people or, you know, attorneys and the rest of it. And not so much Hawaiian and Filipinos there are, you know.
Yeah, sure.
But it seems to me, given the state of the capitalist system as it, you know, manifests itself in Hawaii and in the United States, this is the maximum that can happen in terms of integration of ethnic groups, etc., in the respective classes or class, working class or middle class or like upper class, etc. So this is, you know, here you find that in fact there is some kind of correlation between ethnicity or nationality in the case of the indigenous and class. Yeah. So could you, you know,
Sure, there's an intersection between, in the current situation, ethnicity and class. They reinforce one another. But I would still say ethnicity is more dominant because if class was more significant as the organizing principle in Hawaii, then we would find more of a random distribution in terms of the class status of groups here. We'd find more Filipinos, Hawaiians in the upper class, the upper middle class. And we would find more Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans among the working class. So certainly there are among Chinese immigrants. But instead, what you find is what you just mentioned, this clustering of Haoles, Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans in the upper levels of the socioeconomic status order, or you can call it the class order. And again, a clustering Filipinos, Hawaiians, Samoans in the working class. And that is not the result of the significance of class. I would say ethnicity is the reason for that in regulating access to employment, to education, to wealth and income in society.
Yeah, so there's that relationship. I mean,
sure.
you know, and then discrimination, etc., going. And what reinforces the discrimination, it seems to me, is the, you know, assimilationist concept. You know, that we are all Americans. You can pull yourself by the bootstraps. You know, and not looking at like you have to have at least you know, a level playing field. You know. And you should all start from the same like line, so to speak. But even that, still, even if you started from the same line, you know, if you're not equipped, you know, because of education, etc., it wouldn't mean much, you know, right? I mean, so here, like the problem with the, you know, the way capitalism manifests itself in Hawaii and the social order, right? And then public policy has not met those things. In fact, there's a retreat in terms of public policy, right?
Well, certainly in terms of public education.
Yeah.
I mean, we've seen some, well, it's been ongoing, the underfunding of the K-12 system and the university. But certainly the K-12 system, this has been going on for decades. There was a time whenever there was a budget crisis in Hawaii, the Department of Education would not face the same kind of budget cuts, like 5% budget cut. The rationale was, well, because they serve so many tens of thousands of our students, we shouldn't cut the Department of Education budget. That's no longer the case. I think for at least since the 1990s, it's just like any other department of the state government. And what we've seen instead is huge evidence of underfunding, beginning most recently with the Furlough Fridays, when the recession hit, and so the public schools were closed 17 days.
Governor Linda Lingle, yeah.
But it wasn't necessarily only her fault. This was solved 1 year later, well, in May of 2010, before the legislature closed, by taking $50 million from an emergency fund.
Yeah.
So the money was always there. They didn't have to raise taxes.
Yeah.
But the legislature, not viewing public education as a priority, just let that school year continue without alleviating the furlough Friday, shortening the number of days. If anyone doubted that public education was not a priority of the legislature, that was concrete proof.
Yeah.
But you know, it's not just the legislature. We had this proposed constitutional amendment in the fall of 2018 that was going to be on the ballot that would have provided this surcharge on real property taxes that would fund, well, as planned by the HSTA, the teachers union, the K-12 schools, not the university, but the bill was so modified by the House Education Committee that it became invalid. The Supreme Court ruled against it. But the opposition that came out against that amendment in the fall of 2018, to me, demonstrated not just that public education is not a priority of our legislators, but the people of Hawaii. Surveys showed 56% of the population, well, those surveyed rather, were opposed to the constitutional amendment. Our union was opposed to it.
But
4 counties,
Right.
the Chamber of Commerce, and then this group called Affordable Hawaii Coalition, which received $600,000 in funding from the Chamber of Commerce. All of them opposed to this amendment that would have increased funding for the public schools.
Without necessarily offering an alternative or some kind of, you know, spurious alternative. I would say, because like, you know, these same guys would not say, okay, let's reorder our priorities. For instance, don't give the Hawaii Tourism Authority this much money, put it somewhere else, or other kind of priorities. I don't want to talk about the rail system, but that's another white elephant, I guess. But you know, so these guys in terms of public policy, there's failure. I mean, through and through. I mean, through all the institutions, I guess, from the governor's office all the way to the legislature, etc., because of what you said. And there were other examples, as well. We can also,
Sure.
bring up. But this is like really telling, which leads me to. Later on, we'll talk more about relationship between the indigenous and all of that, because you mentioned it earlier. And I think it's important in terms of equality, inequality, and all of that. And then to bring about the national issue, because like, Hawaiians are not an ethnicity just like,
Sure.
other, But here, this is ethnicity and inequality in Hawaii. And this is 2008 book, very much used in, at the university and other places, very well documented, etc. Based, I guess, on the 2000 census, right? Or 2000 census, because I used it in my classes on Hawaii as well. Yeah, so this is the book. So could you say something about it?
Okay. Well, I had this interest in ethnic stratification in Hawaii from, I think, the early 80s. I wrote an article called Ethnicity and Ethnic Relations in Hawaii. And I used 1970 data, I think, in that article to establish the extent of inequality among groups here in terms of occupation in particular. And then I continued that kind of analysis with 1980, 1990, 2000 census data, most recently 2010 data in an article I published a couple of years ago. And so my argument, I think, has been consistent over the years in terms of ethnicity as the dominant structural principle regulating access to occupation, income, and education. I wish I had data on wealth, but that's much harder to obtain. You really have to do interviews with families to obtain that kind of data. And the only significant change I've seen from, say, 1970 to 2010 is that Japanese Americans became one of the socioeconomically dominant groups in 1990, or based on that data. But for Filipinos, Hawaiians, we don't see much evidence of mobility, certainly not into the middle class. The kinds of educational, occupation, income status they hold is very much indicative of working class status. And this is the issue in Hawaii. We do not have a society that fosters socioeconomic mobility anymore as it did in the immediate post-war World War II decades, up until the 70s at least, 1970 at least. And with the underfunding of public education, this just absolutely worsens the situation, because previously groups could depend on the public school system, the University of Hawaii system, to access a college degree, to be able to attain mobility. But that has become much more difficult over the decades.
Yeah, that's true. But there's a history to that, from the 1920s, in fact, right?
Sure.
And this is, to me, is fascinating, because on the one hand, here comes the haole, or later became haole, because whites became haole, as a group, and they do damage to the indigenous system, etc., through and through. And then they want to ally with the Hawaiians to protect them from the Yellow Menace. I mean, ultimately, the Yellow Menace, etc. So that really created this notion about Hawaiian on one hand, with haole, those oppressor, now they are like allies, and then everybody else who was in the workers' movement, farm, workers, etc., plantation workers. So could you say something about that, and how might have affected that notion of, I want to assimilate because I want to be first-class citizen, you know, in the United States, like in Norway, for instance, you know.
Well,
yeah.
I think what you're getting at is the alliance between Haoles and Hawaiians after the first elections as a territory in November of 1900, because the party that controlled the legislature was not the Republicans. It was the Home Rule Party.
Yes.
And the leader of the Home Rule Party, who was elected as our first non-voting delegate to Congress, was Robert Wilcox, who had led at least
the
two
Wilcox Rebellion.
Yeah, two rebellions against the overthrow of the monarchy. And the Home Rule Party wanted to restore Queen Liliuokalani back to her throne. And so Wilcox and that party were unacceptable to the Haoles. And they were vastly outnumbered by Hawaiians because they were always historically a small population. And
the Haole.
Yeah, and when Hawaii became a territory, it literally meant one man, one vote, because women couldn't vote. And Haoles were outnumbered by Hawaiians who supported their own party. But then through this alliance with Haoles, Hawaiians gained access to patronage jobs in the new territorial and county governments. And in exchange, they agreed to support Republican candidates for office and to run as Republicans rather than as home rulers. And Prince Kuhio, who was behind this alliance, who agreed to the alliance with the Haoles who made the proposal to him, became our non-voting delegate to Congress for the next 20 years.
Yeah. So he became modernized, civilized, you know, into like democratic politics, you know, in terms of the national scene, etc. No, but I wanted to bring that up because this has, you know, historic significance in terms of the division, you know, between Hawaiians and then Japanese, Chinese, Filipinos supporting the Democratic Party and in the '54 revolution, you know, because most of the jobs before were, you know, government jobs were for Hawaiians, etc., and Japanese were, you know, shunted away from that kind of thing. So that's, it's very important to recognize that as an important development, you know, in terms of Hawaii's politics. Yeah.
Well, in the pre-war II period.
Yeah, of course, pre-war.
When the Republicans
because after '54, that's it. You know, I mean, you know, it's a completely different kind of thing, relating to also like you know, preparing the ground for moving from race to ethnicity, and then for discrimination along ethnic lines. You know, in terms of integrating different ethnic groups. In the way that they got integrated in the like upper income, lower income, etc., and that created the discrimination, structural discrimination, etc., because the state structurally was built on that, which is rotten. And now we see the consequence of this in multiple ways, and public policy hasn't been helping at all. You know, in fact, there has been a retreat, as I mentioned before. Yeah, and so in your book here, I mean, it's interesting. Like I was looking at the table of contents, educational inequality and ethnicity, and that is like in terms, that's public policy, right? Socioeconomic inequality and ethnicity, there again, because you mentioned like tourism, this, that, and the other. So, and then Japanese Americans towards symbolic identity. So I'm interested to say why symbolic identity for Japanese Americans, you know, at this point. You know, I mean, we're talking like 21st century, let's say.
Well, in the book, I have a discussion about the construction of ethnic identity among different groups like Japanese Americans, Hawaiians, Okinawans, and Filipino Americans. The chapter on Japanese Americans, it kind of takes off from this idea of symbolic ethnicity that was introduced by a sociologist named Herbert Gans. So he argued that the way what are called the white ethnic groups, Italian Americans, Irish Americans, Polish Americans, Jews, have been able to maintain a sense of their distinct identities is not through maintaining their cultures, but just symbols of their culture.
Mm-hmm.
So it could be through the celebration of very significant annual holidays. So
St. Patrick's Day, for
yeah,
instance.
for Irish Americans, and it's celebrated with special foods and as family. And his argument is this is sufficient to maintain a sense of a distinct identity, an ethnic identity, as opposed to a white racial identity that they also hold. So I applied this idea to Japanese Americans, and I think you can also apply it to Chinese Americans, in the sense that what's called Oshogatsu, New Year's Day, is the annual holiday that is sufficient to maintain a sense of Japanese American ethnic identity. It's celebrated with a family meal, ozoni, vegetarian meal, and this is still the tradition in Japan, and with mochi rice cakes. And
that has waned, in Hawaii,
it
the
has.
mochi.
Well, even ozoni. I mean, each spring semester, I ask my students, how many of you had ozoni on New Year's Day? And it has declined over the years.
Yeah.
Or if they did, it's because they went to the grandmother's house. But at least the tradition continues. So in the case of Japanese Americans, they can maintain this sense of symbolic ethnicity or identity also because there are fewer immigrants in the Japanese American population, say, compared to the Filipinos. Because this idea of symbolic ethnicity or identity, I would not apply to Filipino Americans in Hawaii, because I would argue they maintain their identity substantively. Not symbolically, not because of the arrival of immigrants. And so we have this continuing speaking of Philippine languages and the consumption of Filipino foods, practice of kinship and family norms, such that their identity can be maintained through the daily practice of Filipino culture in Hawaii.
It's interesting, like, in terms of symbolic, identity, Italians, like a classic example, so the Irish here, the U.S., that like St. Patrick's Day, or Cinco de Mayo, etc., becomes universalized. Everybody likes Cinco de Mayo, etc. So in a way, it's a trivialization to me. I'm looking at it. But also, the assimilationist kind of notion, etc. Say, I am American, although I am Italian from whenever. I'm American, and yes, I eat this, that, or the other thing, or I celebrate, whatever, kind of celebration. So it has to do, like, the tension between the ethnicity. So the best manifestation of it would be symbolic, but I am American, and I'm a general in the Navy, for instance, or in the Marines, etc. But I am American, I'm like Italian, So there is that kind of tension, it seems to me. The other thing, which is critical, we have, I think, 10 minutes or so to go. Filipino Americans and this notion of model minority, not only in terms of Filipino Americans, but other things on the continent, Chinese or what have you. But since we are here, are they model minority or dog eaters, as you say that?
Well, in that chapter, what I was arguing is that these are two representations of Filipinos in Hawaii that have been given them. So there's more the racialized ones as dog eaters, which comes out in joke telling about Filipinos. And I looked at all the different comedians in Hawaii. They all had a Filipino dog-eating joke. And the model minority one, I discussed in contrast to how Filipinos historically, before the war, were viewed, as I said, as prone to violence and crime, and this contributed to their overrepresentation among those executed, because people in Hawaii serving on juries were very quick to convict Filipinos brought on trial for first-degree murder. But fortunately, the media does not play up those kinds of racist stereotypes of Filipinos anymore. So I argue the media now represents Filipinos as the model minority in the way that this stereotype was applied to Chinese and Japanese Americans beginning in the mid-60s. By that, I mean, when stories are told in the news media about Filipinos, it tends to play up hardworking, struggling, particularly immigrants, particularly women who have businesses that they run by themselves or who seek to advance themselves into a higher occupational status, despite, for example, having a degree from the Philippines as a teacher or a nurse. Nonetheless, they're going to school to get another degree to advance themselves.
How good they are, you know. Upward mobility, American style, you know. So that's assimilationist in the sense. This model minority is like, you know, going for the American dream, etc., in their own way.
But the point is, in the same way that this model minority stereotype was advanced in the mid-60s, no question is raised about racism and discrimination against Filipinos or other minorities in Hawaii. No one asks, well, why do they have to get another degree?
Exactly.
Why are they working two jobs?
But this is the narration, you know, that, you know, like camouflages racism and discrimination, etc.
As was the case in the 60s, when Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans were held up as the model minority for particularly African Americans, to deny their assertions of racism and discrimination against them, and to argue that America was a society that provided equal opportunity to all.
Then the other thing is that, like, you know, the rainbow thing, you know, in Hawaii is very important. We might like end up with this discussion because it is like, you know, very important, being supported by the upper echelon of society. You know, the ruling elite basically have that kind of rendition, and sometimes some people are socialized into it, because I know from my classes, your classes, etc. So could you say something about that?
You know, this is development from the idea of Hawaii as a multicultural model that emerged in the 1990s. You know, that to some extent is based on some of the ideas from even before the war. Hawaii is a racial paradise, a racial melting pot. So as recently as last summer, there was an article, well, two articles that appeared in the New York Times titled, "Want to be less racist? Move to Hawaii." It was based on the research of a social psychologist in our Department of Psychology here, based on her survey of students from the continent who came to study at the university for several years, and she found, or she argued, that they said they became less racist after studying and living in Hawaii for maybe 3-4 years. But it just is based on a false understanding of what racism is, that exists in people's minds, as opposed to being systemic, that exists, persists in the structures of our society, something that cannot be easily eliminated just by living in Hawaii. Where did the racism against Micronesians come from then? You know, who created that? But it's part of this kind of discourse about Hawaii that persists in the New York Times of all places, and it gets widely disseminated, and people in Hawaii become aware of these kinds of views about where we live, and they buy into them.
You know, a lot of people like think like if you're racist, you like go beat up somebody else from another race or ethnicity, or like cuss him out, or etc. Not knowing, like, if you have paternalistic attitudes toward these people, that's racist. You know, maybe I'm not as high in terms of, or, severe, etc., but still racism. Like, if I treat you because, I am Haole and you are Filipino, let's say, oh, good boy, that's paternalistic, that's racism. Whereas you have to, like, really show, like, there's no racism through public policy.
Yeah, sure.
And equality. I mean, real equality, not the baloney kind of equality. So I just want to do that. We have still like a few minutes, 3 minutes, etc. And so I want to talk a little bit about the indigenous, versus the local. What kind of tensions might there be? And we'll probably end up with this.
Well,
regarding what
I
we're
think,
talking
I think
about.
the Mauna Kea struggle is really a historic moment in the sovereignty movement. As many people have compared it to Kaho'olawe and the stand there that eventually resulted in the ending of the bombing. I think particularly the young people have been leading the protests for the struggle at Mauna Kea. Have really drawn a line in the sand, and they're committed to that struggle, and they'll be back. There is this kind of stalemate at this point, but I'm hopeful that a very positive resolution will result because of the way that they're so committed to protect the Mauna and to prevent the construction of the telescope. And for local people, I wish more would support that movement in different kinds of ways. We find, well, people are primarily expressing negative views about that struggle. I went to Hilo last October. I was talking to my cab driver taking me to the campus there, and he was calling these guys troublemakers and all that kind of stuff. Sort of thing.
And some Hawaiians say that too. So much socialized, like colonization of the mind.
Yeah, that could be present too. But for most local people, and certainly I think at the university we have this movement among the students and some of the faculty to support that struggle. And I'm hopeful that something will result that will prevent the telescope from being constructed.
Yeah. I was just looking at your background, education. You mentioned anthropology, University of London, University College of London, 1983. And BA, anthropology and math. Very good. And University of Southern California, 1971. And if people go to the Ethnic Studies website and click on faculty, they can take a look at our faculty, etc. But look at your research that actually started, as you mentioned, with your PhD about Filipinos and so on. And then you continued with that, plus talking about Japanese and Hawaii and all of that. So this is really a very nice, the way I look at it, very nice trajectory, in terms of your career, etc. And I know that you will be missed in our department.
Well, I think looking back to when I was hired in 2000 as a tenure-track faculty member, it was due especially to your support and Noel Kent. I think the two of you were my strongest backers for the position, and certainly have remained not just colleagues but friends since that time, working in the department and sometimes working on the same kinds of political struggles, certainly.
Yeah. So I think we're flat out of time. Thank you very much.
No, thank you, Barry. My pleasure.
And aloha. See you next month.